This week on the agenda, the trophy has been lifted, the final goal scored. But who really gained the most from the 2026 FIFA World Cup? And what does it tell us about the future of football? This was the biggest World Cup ever. A record 48 teams playing 104 matches over 39 days across 16 North American cities, ending in a victory for Spain. And with a bigger tournament came new faces. Curacao, Cape Verde, Uzbekistan, Jordan all made memorable World Cup debuts, while more than 6.25 million supporters packed the stadiums. More teams and more fans also meant more money. FIFA is set to report record revenues of around $15 billion from this latest World Cup cycle, including around $3 billion in sponsorship alone, up 55% from the run-up to Qatar 2022. So, more countries, more matches and more cash. But as the World Cup grows, is football bringing the world together, or just giving governments and global corporations an even bigger stage? And when the dust settles, who really won this year's World Cup? Joining me now to give us their verdict are football journalist Tim Vickery, Kieran Maguire, author of The Price of Football, James Kitching, former director of football regulatory at FIFA, and Mehreen Khan, economics editor of the Times newspaper and host of the podcast Heroes and Humans of Football. Tim, I want to start with you, because when people look back on this tournament, what do you think they'll actually remember? What did this World Cup produce a football story that's really going to change the game?
Well, I think one of the big stories is that although in so many fields of human activity, Europe is becoming increasingly less relevant, in football the reverse seems to happen. Germany in 2014 were the first European side to win in South America, and now Spain have been the first European side to win in North America. And the dominance of Europe is striking. And that includes, I think, to the rise of African football, which has a lot to do with talent produced in Europe. So I think certainly, and I make my living in South America, from a South American perspective, this World Cup was quite worrying.
Kieran, what about you? What was your single most memorable moment of the tournament?
I think that was the Balogun red card reversing. We've always spoken about potential interference or the use of politics to exploit football in the past, but it's never impacted upon what we've seen on the pitch. And I think this was this was quite astounding. When I speak to my friends in America, they say, "Well, you're making a big fuss about nothing." I think that unwritten contract that we have with the game, that whatever's happening outside the pitch doesn't interfere on the pitch. So I think that's been ripped up.
Did you think that that's something that we'll see in future tournaments?
Well, if we go back as far as Mussolini in 1934, there's always been some form of political interference in football. So it's never been as blatant as it was in this tournament. If it works once, why can't it work again? I think it set a very nasty precedent for the independence of referees and for that belief in the fairy tale that we have in football.
We'll talk a little bit more about the politics of this World Cup as we go on. But Mehreen, let me bring you in now, because one thing FIFA will certainly remember will be the amount of money that the World Cup has drawn in. $15 billion, they're saying, more than 50% higher than the previous tournament in Qatar. How is that money changing the game?
Well, the money will be distributed by FIFA to its constituent members who were part of the World Cups in this expanded format. We knew it was going to be the most lucrative World Cup in history, one, because it's longer, there's more teams, but also because they introduced a new ticketing system, a pricing system where fans were actually going to be paying much more than they ever had to attend a World Cup. There were fears at the beginning of the tournament that some stadiums just would be empty, particularly for group stages. it turned out that actually, in terms of, supply and demand, there is limited supply and there is inelastic demand, as economists say, because people were paying thousands of pounds. And you saw in the final there were these even special seats, which I don't know, eye-watering amounts of money. They're apparently the best seats in the house, where you could even get a couch and sit by the stadium. But people did pay, and it will be a vindication. FIFA will at least see it as a vindication of this new dynamic pricing system, because it didn't really produce the empty seats, and it produced a lot of dollars.
It didn't produce the empty seats, Mehreen, but did it present a different class of fan? Because the numbers you're talking about, I mean, we're talking 5 figures for sometimes quite standard seats.
It's always been expensive to watch sports in America. So if you ask the average American sports fan, if they're a baseball or an American football fan, about paying upwards of hundreds and sometimes thousands of pounds for tickets, that would not be unusual. For your average European, South American, someone coming from Africa, this is a lot of money. But we heard stories about people remortgaging their houses, selling everything they have to be there. Scottish fans who invaded Boston for a whole week. People did use their life savings to have this one in a lifetime opportunity, especially for smaller countries that were attending for the first time. So I'm sure it will be seen as a vindication. Whether or not it should be the kind of demographic or the socioeconomic classes of people that are allowed to be football, should it be this exclusionary, is a bigger moral question. But for now, I think FIFA will probably continue and persist with dynamic pricing because it worked. It's also important to say America is the biggest economy in the world, where there is more disposable income than in other countries. And that won't be the case, for example, when we're in 2030 and there are going to be games played in Uruguay or in Portugal, where average living standards are lower. So let's see if it still produces the kind of enormous sums of money, because people will just pay through the nose and pay whatever they can to be there.
Well, that's the fans. James, I want to talk to you about what FIFA's going to do with its pot of money. I mean, it's officially a not-for-profit organisation. So how will all the money, the $15 billion or so, be spent in the run-up to the next World Cup tournament?
I think that the most important thing to remember how FIFA structures itself financially is the Men's World Cup generally pays for the next 4 years of operations until the next Men's World Cup. So the money that's made at the Men's World Cup covers every other tournament that FIFA holds, whether it's a Women's World Cup, it's the Youth World Cups, the Esports World Cup that used to have, etc., etc. And that money does get, as Mehreen mentioned, redistributed back to the football associations. If my maths is correct, from what I recall, it was about $1.5 million per year, US per year, is redistributed to the 211 associations per year, whether that is the biggest association or the smallest association. And then there are other grant and development programs where that money does get spent on special projects, such as building national training centres, funding national coaches and other types of support that national football associations need. So it's one of the things that perhaps the sports governing bodies don't really beat their chest about enough, which they probably should, but is that the vast majority of the funding that is raised from the major tournaments goes back into football development, whether through the national associations or back to the clubs that produce the players that end up playing at the competitions themselves.
So on the clubs that produce the players and of football teams at every level, Tim, what does this mean in terms of the grassroots football? Can you see this World Cup having an impact there?
Well, we're clearly seeing the rise of African football. Africa performed well at this World Cup. And the big, I think, argument for the expansion to 48 teams was that Africa was underrepresented. Now, there'll be a core of African teams who will qualify for 3 or 4 World Cups in a row, and they will acquire experience and they will get better. And there's also the European diaspora as well that Africa is certainly leaning into. But this is the big argument that FIFA can make, and it's a good argument that whether the fans need to be scalped on this extent, I think is a huge moral point, because obviously the vast majority of the money comes from the sale of TV rights. But it is laudable that the money does go back into national associations, enabling the less competitive to become more competitive. And in that sense, I think the expansion to 48 clearly will work with Africa. Asia, I think, is more problematic. The performance of the Asian sides, with the exception of Japan and now Australia, who have a lot of European-based players. But in general, I think the performance of the Asian sides was extremely poor. But you can clearly see big hope for African football, in part because of this money, which will be redistributed.
I do want to talk about how big tournaments like this can get a little bit later. But Kieran, first of all, I want to come back to the politics. You mentioned Balogun, and I think we can all agree that this tournament was politicised like no other. You know, from the awarding of new FIFA Peace Prize back in December to President Trump's concerns about visas, immigration rules, political tensions, security. I mean, the list just goes on. Is it inevitable now that in a world where we have sport, it's going to become a key strategic asset?
Absolutely. We've only got to look at the viewing figures across the world. You've got the eyeballs of practically every sports fan in every country around the world who tune into the World Cup. So therefore, it can be used as a vehicle for people to spread a political message, to get their agendas across. And it's not new. You know, Tim's in South America. Go back to Argentina in 1978. You look at what happened in Brazil itself in 2014. There were political moves. There was political exploitation of the tournament. You've only got to look at what's happened here in the UK when they were given the Olympics in 2012. That was politically motivated as much as anything else. So it's an unfortunate facet of modern day football. It's become so spectacularly successful, and that money has, as James was implying, will be distributed within football itself. If you've got $15 billion worth of revenue coming in, the winners of the tournament, Spain, got 40 million. The teams that provided, the 784 teams that were represented at this World Cup, will collectively get around about $250 million in compensation. Well, that still leaves far more than $10 billion worth of profit to be distributed. My concern is that you then get political interference when it goes out to individual countries and individual football associations where issues of governance are not necessarily particularly well followed.
Well, let's stick with political interference and what goes on in the corridors of power, James, because the Vice President of the United States Soccer Federation criticised FIFA President Gianni Infantino for cozying up to Donald Trump, adding he made a Faustian bargain with the US President. What do you make of that? And how might FIFA strike a better balance in the future?
It's a great question. I think it's, if I'm going to use a cricket phrase, I'm sorry, it's a bit of horses for courses sometimes, depending on the country that you're in. I think the reality is for all international sports federations, whether you are FIFA or another one, when you award the rights to host a major international competition, that leverage that you have during the bidding process, and despite the fact that you have, very strongly written contracts which provide you with the world effectively, that leverage disappears when you've awarded a host and that host starts to do the things that the host needs to do in terms of getting its cities ready, getting its stadia ready, getting everything ready to running a World Cup. And to be quite frank, when you are probably in one of the most volatile environments when it comes to democratic decision making in the US, because of the various different jurisdictions, different cities, different states, federal governments, in terms of trying to coordinate all of that, it is quite difficult. Notwithstanding, the comments that were made by the Vice President of the USSF, that's perhaps some eyebrow-raising things that have happened. I would not disagree with that along the journey. But at the end of the day, there has to be a strong relationship between the sports governing body and the federal government and the state government, and even however far low you go down in terms of the governmental levels, to be able to actually run the tournament effectively and efficiently. And I think what the argument you don't look at from the other side, from FIFA, would be is we did everything that we could to ensure that our tournament ran properly and was successful. And I can imagine others might have comments to make about that, but I think that's where you try and justify many of the things that have gone along the way.
Well, we judge it on football and we judge it on performance, but what about the country's image, Mehreen? I mean, what do you think this tournament has really done for America's image abroad? Did it just expose existing tensions in US relations with the rest of the world?
It's difficult. I mean, Donald Trump has been a fixture of most of our lives, whether we like it or not, and whether we're American or not, for the last decade. There is something brazen and unabashed about Donald Trump, and we saw that play out with the Balogun affair. He just went out and told us what happened, gave Johnny a call and said it was very unfair and he didn't like it. So even applying the tag like sports washing to the US or Trump doesn't really work, because there's no real attempt at camouflaging or putting your best foot forward. The treatment of the Iranian team showed, egregious treatment of the Iranian team showed that there was no attempt to put the US's best foot forward or think the geopolitics doesn't matter. So I don't think anything about America surprised people watching. I imagine for the fans who were there, they probably enjoyed the hospitality and, enjoyed being in parts of Kansas or LA more than, us watching at home. I think if there's one country that probably took a blow to its soft power, it's got to be Argentina. There seemed to be really, I don't want to say unanimous, but a very clear sense in which Argentina were the team everyone was rooting against. Of course, their fellow South Americans, but the rest of us too, because of I think some of the really unsavory tactics they deployed, some of the petulance of their players. So bizarrely enough, I don't think people are going to come away from this World Cup thinking that they found out anything new about the US or Donald Trump, but they might have changed their minds on Argentina, especially if they were growing up in the Maradona era where you had much more romantic images about Argentina. And even Messi got caught up in this because, he was seen on the pitch, telling the referee that he should send off Cucurella for covering his mouth. Like it was really, there was something a little bit irredeemable about this Argentine team. And I think that is probably what 2026 might be known for.
Tim, let's talk about another controversial innovation at this Games, rehydration breaks. When even in air-conditioned stadiums, everything stopped mid-half for the players to get a drink. How do you think that affected the game, but also the spectator experience?
Yeah, well, it becomes a game of four quarters. It's along with like the Super Bowl style show at halftime, an attempt to Americanise the game. You've got more commercial breaks and so on. Football doesn't need, and the hydration break in certain circumstances, yes, but not in the air-conditioned stadiums. The halftime show, it clearly doesn't need. Football is different. I mean, we've gone into some of the difference between US sports. They are more entertainment. Football is culture. Football, you want let the fans make the atmosphere. Take away the pipe music beforehand. Let the fans make the atmosphere. Take away the halftime show. If the game's good, at halftime you need oxygen. You don't need a show. This is clearly part of the relationship between FIFA and the host country. And I know that long after the decision had been made to award the 2010 World Cup to South Africa and the 2014 World Cup to Brazil, those countries very, very much felt bullied by FIFA all the way along the line. Subsequently, it's been different with Qatar, on the eve of the World Cup there, Qatar banning alcohol sales. That showed that the boot was on the other foot. And here in this World Cup, it seems clear that FIFA has been bullied by the United States, especially with the immigration policy. Now, this, I think, is a problem for Infantino because Infantino is power-based and he sees himself very much as a defender of the global South. And the US, the immigration policy with this World Cup, with fans, with officials, even with a referee, a FIFA referee, not allowed in. Now, FIFA sets great store by defending the football family, but it seems openly did very, very little to defend the football family in this instance, because when no one forces you to host the World Cup, when you enter into an arrangement of this type, you are in fact signing a contract with the rest of the world saying you are welcome. Now, that clearly wasn't the case. And I wonder what the implications will be there for Infantino for doing so little to defend those members of the football family from the global South, wanting to go to the World Cup, either as fans, even as players in the case of one country, including a referee. I wonder what the implications of that are going to be for Infantino.
I think it goes back to my point before about leverage. And, Tim, you picked up something as actually was thinking about but didn't raise, and exactly the same thing happened right before the Qatar World Cup, as mentioned, with respect to alcohol. There are certain points in the cycle of hosting where where you as the governing body still have that ultimate leverage where you can attempt to force things on or potentially even remove a tournament. But as you get closer to the tournament, you are beholden to your hosts. And if your hosts are able to implement and are enforcing policy within their own country as their national laws allow, then you have to work in and around that. Actually, I take Tim's point absolutely about defending and some of the things that FIFA had to perhaps close their mouths over with respect to what had happened with the African Referee of the Year, the fans being denied visas. I also think there was notwithstanding it wasn't an absolutely perfect or great scenario, but actually getting Iran participating in the tournament, when I strongly believe, personally, without having any evidence, but I strongly believe that members of the American administration would absolutely not have wanted them there. That was, I think, a win, but that goes to that point of leverage. And that point, bullying is probably a good word for it, where a government can stand up and say, you're in our country now, notwithstanding that we've signed this contract, whether it's a contract with the world, or it's a social contract, or whether it's a formal contract. A government can say, this is what we're doing. So there's a point there where perhaps in the past sports governing bodies have come into countries and said, well, this is what we want to do, and this is what, if you want our tournament, you have to host it. And to Tim's point, the last couple of editions of the Men's World Cup have certainly showed that countries with strong policy background and with that leverage of the money, with the tournament being on their doorstep, and distinctly removed from that point where the governing body can actually do something about it.
Can I ask James a brief question?
Go for it.
Which is, now obviously this isn't going to happen, but the Los Angeles Olympics are in 2 years, and that's not 48 teams, that's the entire world. Given the fact that huge swathes of the world have not been made welcome at this World Cup, would you favour the IOC taking the Olympic Games away from Los Angeles?
It's an interesting question, because whether you'd favour it or not, I don't think they'd be in a position to do it. That's quite frank, because you are, what are we, 2 years now?
That's why I said it's not going to happen. But would you favour it?
I think it would send a very strong message. I think it would send a very strong message if they, if they did go down that pathway, subject to, how things are going to look out. To be honest with you, I don't know the circumstances around how they're negotiating the athlete participation, the officials' participation, etc. But if it's similar to what has happened in the lead up to this tournament, and how, how certain parts of the world, the global south, however you describe it, have been treated, whether it's fans, officials, players, administrators, etc., I think they would be looking at it very concerned. And there were some, and no doubt having those discussions as these things are going on live over the past year, as we've seen, delegates not being admitted to congresses or team workshops and things like that. So certainly I think there would be a lot of red flags in Lausanne.
Kieran, we've mentioned here that this tournament was 48 teams, the biggest yet. FIFA President Infantino's opened the door to future expansion. We're talking around about 64 teams, and something that the head of Spain's La Liga has said was in danger of destroying the football industry. He called for Infantino to step down over it. Do you think that FIFA is in danger of getting too big for its football boots?
I think FIFA is doing what's best for FIFA, which is to make as much money as it can for the individual associations, to make as much money itself, to incur its ever increasing running costs. You take a look at its legal bill, you take a look at its marketing bill, you take a look at its financial bill. Those costs have to be covered. A 64-team tournament on the back of what we've just seen will be a spectacular financial success. I was talking to somebody in broadcasting, and he said, going back to Tim's points about the advertising breaks, and let's call them for what they are. I mean, this is the type of thing which really sticks in the throat, I think, of fans. It's when FIFA try to manipulate the truth to bend it to their will. You've got 104 games times 2 additional breaks times 3-minute breaks where you can fit in 4 adverts at $200,000 a throw if you're Fox. Those sums transformed the enthusiasm for the tournament, and they will continue in the future because money talks and FIFA listens to money. And remember, that money gets redistributed to the individual football associations who are about to vote for the coronation, not the democratic process, the coronation of Gianni Infantino for his 3.5 tier as FIFA president, even though there's a cap of 3.
But if we come back to this notion of the culture of football, and that was what being important, Mehreen, a bigger tournament is going to be more spots for smaller teams, like Cape Verde, like Curacao, who gave us some of the standout moments of this tournament.
Exactly, it's true. It's also just worth saying that, the likes of Jordan, Uzbekistan, Curacao, they were there, very small countries. Italy wasn't there, Russia wasn't there. India and China, the two most populous countries in the world and among the five biggest economies in the world, weren't there. So it is more of the world, but there are still huge parts of the world that aren't represented at the World Cups. 64, you would think, would be completely unwieldy. It would also mean that future World Cups will have to be cross-continental. As it stands, Saudi Arabia is apparently a single country host in 2034. Will they have the facilities, 64 facilities, sporting facilities and camps to have teams? Logistically, this is going to become a much more difficult exercise. We're just going to split World Cups between countries. We're going to probably have to split them with continents, which is what's happening in 2030 because it's the anniversary of the World Cup, hence sort of special centenary matches that are going to be held in South America as well as in Spain, Portugal, and Morocco. So it's worth to sort of, just also to Kieran's point, yes, it would generate more money, but then you'd also have to divide it among 64. So there might be countries that just lose out if the pot does get bigger because it may not get commensurately bigger to make sure everyone benefits. So I think there might even be a financial difficulty of having a bigger World Cup. Infantino has opened the door. This is obviously being pushed by the head of the South American Football Association because they want more games in 2030. But I still think that this is going to be there is no inevitability about the expansion. I think actually, even on the bottom line, it might not end up working for FIFA as well as we think. Just because it's bigger, it also means more money. It just means that you have to split it among even more participants.
Tim, has this World Cup changed what winning looks like? I mean, because for some countries it wasn't about lifting the trophy, it was about influence, attracting investment, showcasing themselves to the world.
And more countries had an opportunity to do that. And the fear of the dilution of quality, I don't think that was really justified. I think in the end, mathematically, it doesn't work very well, does it, 48? When 64 works far better from a mathematical point of view. But as we've just been hearing, it's an absolute logistical nightmare. But the smaller or less traditional countries who went to the World Cup, I think many of them come away extremely happy with their participation. And for those countries, it's a moment where, when the national anthem is blaring out, they are proudly saying to the rest of the world, we exist. You don't think about us very much, if at all, but we exist. And I always find that quite a touching moment.
James,
I think you can argue that it's the Olympics of football, the World Cup, with this move from 48 and then to 64 teams. And again, I go back to Tim's point, is that it allows those countries which don't get any focus on a traditional basis to now get noticed. And it's a sense of incredible pride domestically. So I think that part of it is to be encouraged. We didn't see the thrashings of those smaller teams. So again, it justifies the expansion from a footballing point of view. And I think we need to focus on that just as much as the financial benefits of the expansion.
I mean, James, this tournament gave us new football stories, new football heroes, but it also highlighted the growing financial divide in the game. So when you put all of those things together, are you optimistic about the future of international football?
Absolutely optimistic about the future of international football. I mean, look, the comments I think I saw in the last couple of days about club football being the beating heart of football and driving that tribalism is absolutely correct. But at the same time, when the international tournaments occur, you just see the support, the attention, and just the feeling that you actually get through with a lot of the players, officials, let alone all of us who are sitting there watching and cheering for our team. So I certainly don't think there's any pessimism about international football that I would have come out of the World Cup. I would just say that my head is spinning a little bit talking about a 64-team World Cup and just the operational monster I think that would be.
James Kitching, Mehreen Khan, Tim Vickery and Kieran Maguire, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Coming up on a future agenda, who will run the UN next? We'll speak to some of the candidates vying to become the new Secretary General. But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.